Well, welcome to our spring webinar series sponsored by the Collaborative on Faith and Disability. My name is Eric Carter, and I'm part of the Collaborative and a member of the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, University Center on Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And I'm thrilled you have joined us for our final webinar of the spring season, focused on state-of-the-art practices in inclusive religious education. And we have three wonderful presenters, Barb Newman, Tori White, and Reverend LaTanya Penny, who will be joining us in just a minute. But we're thrilled you're with us and excited to share a bit about the state of the art in this particular area of ministry. I just wanted to begin by sharing a little bit of background about the Collaborative on Faith and Disability for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. It is a network of university centers across the country who share this vision and mission that you see on your screen to ensure that people with disabilities and their families are able to thrive in all areas of life, including in the areas of faith and spirituality, and to have opportunities to share their gifts and talents and presence and participation in faith and friendship within the context of a congregational community. That network of collaborative partners spans 14 different states, and some of the logos of those entities are here on your screen. If you're wanting to learn more about the Collaborative and its work, you can find more information at www.faithanddisability.org. Just to get us started on the webinar, I wanted to highlight just a few important notes before we get started. The first is that the webinar is being recorded, and so we'll post it along with all of our past webinars on our website, and that will probably happen later this week. And then from that point, you can share this widely with others in your network who weren't able to be on today. We also, as I mentioned, have a series of past webinars from the last 3 or 4 years, as well as a number of videos focused on issues around disability and theology that are also archived on our website, and we'll encourage you to check that out as well. We'll post the slides and any resources that our speakers mention, as well as the recording, very shortly on our website. But I would encourage you along the way, don't wait till the end, but along the way, post your questions as they come up in the chat box. We're going to allocate at least the last 10 minutes or so to get to your questions, but we encourage you to post them as you think about them so we can make sure our presenters can stew on them and provide their feedback there towards the end as well. So all of your phones are silenced, but you can use the chat box to post those questions. So with that background, let me turn it over to our presenters, Barb Newman and Tori White, who are both with the CLC Network, and Reverend LaTanya Penny, who's a consultant and with Mary's Grace. And we're excited to hear what they have to share about what we know about inclusive religious education. So pass it on to you, Barb and Tori.
Very good. Well, this is a great opportunity to talk about some of the amazing things that we have seen across the country and actually in North America, and perhaps even some things we've heard about from some other countries. But just talking about the state-of-the-art practices in inclusive religious education, Tori and I get a front row seat to some of that happening, so that we have the opportunity to learn through our organization, CLC Network, about, now we're having some trouble advancing the slide, so give us just 1 minute here. But we have the opportunity to learn from so many different congregations. So we often get to visit communities where their goal is to say, look, we want to worship with people of all abilities, and we're expecting persons with all abilities to be part of this gathering, whether that's children, youth, adult settings. So we often go as speakers or consultants, but really get a chance to learn from what they are doing as well. So they asked us to think about what are some of those places, again, that you see state-of-the-art practices. And I would say we have 7 things we wanted to talk about today. The first one just being questions and ownership. We've been doing this for quite some time, and so since the late 1990s, have really, as an organization, wanted to come alongside congregations to say, how can we facilitate what it is you believe God wants you to do in this area? And when we first started, I would say there wasn't a lot of awareness. If we went to a conference, we were often placed in the quote-unquote special needs track, and I really fought against that, and I said, really, if this is a children's ministry conference, this needs to be part of what everybody is thinking about. boy, has that changed over the years. The awareness has changed, and I would say the questions have changed. When we first began, it was about, well, should we? Or no, we don't really have anything. And that has changed very much into how. How do we do this? Instead of should we accept this particular child or youth into our program, now the question is, they're there. How do we do this? Could you have any tools or tips? And so because we come as an organization from a educational background, we were always pleased to try to provide those how-to tools. And that has been what we've tried to do. I think also a big change, not only with the questions, but also with the spaces. The questions were used to be about, we're thinking of providing a separate space, the room 7, the special treasures, the special wing.
We're going to start a special needs ministry so that we have somewhere for those kids to come when they come to our church.
Very much language that was separate and will build something. And that has changed so much. And, we're just delighted that that has changed so much, so that we have instead, questions of how do we do this all together? And I think one of the biggest pieces that we have learned is a change in ownership. So we were part of both of these conferences this past school year. One was held in the Nashville area and one was held in Orlando. But they draw children's ministry and family ministry leaders from all over the country and North America, I would say, and even from some other...
Yeah, some South America even.
Mm-hmm. And so it's a great sampling of questions and what are people asking. But again, it wasn't about building those separate spaces. And who was asking the question was different. The questions were coming from not the disability coordinator or whatever word they have for that kind of individual in a congregation. This was the children's pastor saying, look, I own 100% of the children, so how can I help support children with varied abilities? And so it was a refreshing change of conversation. I think we had one person at each conference ask how they could start a separate area. Yeah.
What was really exciting too was to hear the youth director maybe even standing next to the children's ministry director saying, yeah, we need to put in place a plan for when these kids come up into my program, then they're my kids, and I need to know what tools and resources have been working for you or what's been in place and how do we make this transition work. So that was a really exciting time for us to think of exactly who's owning the individuals who are coming into the spaces.
Right. And I think one of the exciting parts of that is a graphic we often use. So excuse this. I hope people have already eaten their lunch because this might make you hungry. But one of the things we often talk about is churches tend to build cans of things. They have a can for children's ministry and a can for youth ministry and a can for evangelism ministry and a can for seniors ministry or men's ministry, whatever that might be. And what they tended to think about was how can we build a can called accessibility ministry, disability ministry, whatever you want to, whatever words they put around that within their congregation. But again, we often say that is way less helpful because you already have 20 to 25% in each can that statistically would have some kind of known or stated disability. And so we often say you're much better off becoming shredded cheese and taking some expertise and coming alongside that children's pastor and youth pastor and worship pastor and men's ministry pastor to bring this casserole, a congregational casserole where people of all abilities are worshiping, learning together. And I think that's truly what has been happening. And there are such people known as a disability coordinator, but they were often standing with their children's pastor or with the youth pastor at those conferences looking for information. And I will say that's also true. I am delighted to be part of the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship and am a partner affiliate with them. And again, who owns this initiative? Is this about some committee or is it about natural leadership within the church saying, look, I own 100% of the worshipers who come into our congregation. Now, how can I put some things together? And we were delighted with a comment. I never knew as a worship pastor that I needed to think about this, but it's clear that I do. the delight of having those natural leaders be in charge is that they can make a change instantly. The next day, the next Sunday, if they want the PowerPoint slides to be more attuned to readability standards, well, they can put that in place. If they want to provide fidget bags in the pews for all of the worshipers that might need that, they can make that decision. So those are people with budgets. They're people that have the opportunity to make some changes. And that, I think, is one of the most exciting changes that I have seen. And, we always say, look, if you remember nothing else, think shredded cheese. Please don't build a can. But think of how you could come alongside each one of your existing areas or leaders and say, how can we best think for all of the children who are part of children's ministry, or all of the seniors who are part of your seniors ministry? So that's one of the biggest things that we've talked about.
And what gets to be really exciting is that then they sort of say, well, wait a minute, this makes sense, except that instead of being sort of a ministry at the forefront, it's like a ministry to the other ministries, because it's this one person who gets to resource each of the other ministries. And so they are the person who is just thinking for this and bringing that to the table at every staff meeting. And again, thinking about it when it comes time to propose the budget, or time to propose what they're going to do for the Easter service, or what have you. It's always that one person who can just say, how are we thinking for people with varied abilities? And therefore those other ministries can come back and say, I ran into this situation. You're the person I should go to with this question. So, can you help me think through this? And it just builds this synergy in how to manage this well. So it's been a really great system from what we've seen churches who have tried and get out that way.
And you were at a church, Tori, in the Holland, Michigan area that has, they don't call themselves the disability.
Yeah, no, they right away wanted to start an inclusion team. And they have come around a few individuals. One happens to be deaf, and so the entire inclusion team is learning ASL. They're actually renovating the church right now and adding on, almost doubling their size, but they're making it completely accessible in all ways, with elevators and flat entrances and ramps and things. And their inclusion team is just constantly on the lookout for how to resource every other person in the ministries of the church.
Right.
Yep.
So again, in another church we've worked with, they formed the MUD team, the Madison Universal Design Team. That was the name of that, because they feel so strongly, let's just think universal design, not just for space, but also universal design for learning. And how can we get set up to say, look, let's just say from the beginning, we are expecting people of all abilities to be here together in Sunday school or in worship. So we're going to get ready for that ahead of time. So I think we're delighted with that. That's number one. I think the next one that we've seen huge changes on, partly because I think our world at large has seen some significant changes here, but just being more aware that people have very differently wired sensory systems. And while I don't have a ton of time to go into that, if that's an unfamiliar place to you, let's just say this. If you're sitting in a basketball game and that buzzer goes off to signal the end of the game, you'll have some people clap their hands over their ears, and some people be totally oblivious because they didn't hear the sound go off. And then you have people somewhere in the middle. But we all take in sensory pieces of information at a different level. And I think, so often now movie theaters, as a matter of course, offer sensory-friendly movie showings. And I think churches have really taken this to heart. And it does, it calls for people to be sensitive and to lay some things down. So if it's Easter Sunday, and they really wanted this trumpet blasting from the back, they need to think, is this going to be a celebrative for everybody here or not? And how can we bring joy into an Easter service, or how can we bring that particular instrument into what we're doing inside of worship on this day without alienating some of the individuals? And reminded us of a passage in Philippians 2, verse 4, where it says, let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. And some examples of that, and again, for just a brief explanation, but often say sensory systems wired at middle C are happy ones. On a keyboard, a piano keyboard, you block so many things out and you take in what you need. But some people are wired way above middle C, just a little bit of that sound and it registers, and other people might be wired way below middle C, and you need a ton of that information in order to register. So somewhere along that continuum, we have all of our worshipers in one space, we have all the children and children's ministry together, and you've got this really energetic person trying to lead them, and so they get up and they say, woohoo, everybody, let's sing, let's really hear it, sing louder. And you've got some other kids that are like, I am never coming back here again. So again, it's sort of this chance to think. And I guess innovation is what we have seen. We went to a church in Oklahoma, and they had built a beautiful sensory room. And in this room, families were welcome to be part of that. They could have some individuals take sort of breaks in this area. It was a calming space with some tools in there to allow individuals to sort of regulate those sensory systems if what was happening in their setting, be that a children's setting, youth, adult setting, just became a little bit too overwhelming. Or that person needed to move, and movement wasn't totally appreciated in whatever setting they were in. And so it gave an option. There was also a live stream in that church, so it was live streamed right into that area. Similar, I was in Grosse Pointe a few weeks ago speaking at that church, and they too had found a space. And this one didn't happen to have live stream. This was totally more for just a break, but very aware that some individuals could use that. A couple of kids, maybe with some friends, would go and use that from a children's ministry setting. Very exciting. I suppose one of my favorites is in this church in Fairway, a Christian Reformed church. They actually, if you go on their website, list, we have 3 options for you as you worship with us today. So they just build in the options. They don't wait for somebody to say, oh, it's too loud. They've got 3 options every single time you go for worship. And they said, you could join us in the main sanctuary. You could join us in the fellowship room around round tables. And they had round tables set up with chairs and some items in the middle. A lot of families would sit in that space. And then they developed another room. Again, the service had a live stream into that space, but then people had the ability to move, turn the sound way down. They could totally control that from within that setting. So that's a beautiful example, I think, of just building in options from the get-go.
That is a church that's very much thinking for all the various levels of middle C, above or below. They have sound blockers available for everyone to use. They have the live stream so that you can edit the sound in each of the environments. And even just having the multiple environments allowing for movement options and for entire families to feel welcome in any of the spaces. Mm-hmm. And all of it is available but kept safe as well. So even in the sensory room, all of the equipment is kept in a closet so that it's not just out in the room for people to come in and for kids to sort of run wild or to think that it's a play space. It's genuinely a worship space. It's an alternative worship space. And I think that wording can be very carefully put into place too. We don't want to have sensory breaks and sensory toys that are just sort of pulling away from worship. This is us engaging in worship in a way that our bodies and our minds are going to engage successfully. So thinking about it that way and having them as alternative worship spaces has been very effective in that community. It's really blessed a lot of families.
It is. It's exciting. I think, we've talked about the questions and the ownership shifting, people being much more aware of differently wired sensory systems and catching the drift that this is not just about children, but really people making decisions. I know as my dad walked through a different time of dementia and different stages, certainly sensory differences became a huge issue for him. And again, we think often of children, or we hear sensory differences and we think of children with autism or youth with autism. This impacts so many different people for a variety of reasons. I think just being aware of that issue. We do have on the clcnetwork.org website a really cool video called One Body. And if you want to think a little bit more deeply about worship and sensory issues, that's a good video to watch or bring to your community as you think about that together.
And thinking about some of the different causes for that may be different than what you might already assume as far as, kids with a diagnosis like autism or ADHD and some other illnesses and things that may bring that on. So,
right. So, we want to move on because we want to make sure we have time for all of the 7 that we wanted to talk about. But I think another piece that we have seen communities really think about is stocking equipment. We often will say, if you have the right stuff, it makes it a lot easier to say we are expecting people of all abilities to be part of whatever program is part of the church, and so or the congregation. And I think so many times we will walk into a children's area or even an entire an entire worship service or a setting with adults or children and adults, and we have found that they are just beginning to stock equipment, fidget pencils. And like you mentioned, Tori, there was a great sign in the bulletin. If one of your family members would appreciate sound blocking headphones, you can obtain those at the visitor station. Feel free to sign out a pair.
And this is such a great way to say you are welcome here. We are expecting you. I have a friend who takes wiggle cushions, like you'll see pictured up here on the very top left, gives a good cushion of air on the seat so that someone actually can have movement in their chair rather than being on the hard pew or the chairs that we're expecting them to sit on for a long time. And actually allowing that movement helps them to engage in the content that they're trying to pay attention to. But so I have a friend who would carry those along with her every Sunday in their Sunday bag and pass it along to whichever one of her family members needed it at the moment. And she would get these terrible glares from all of her of the congregation members. And she finally just said, well, we need this. It's a tool for our family, so we bring it. And so what does it say when the church already has it there to say, you're welcome here. You're not the odd person out. We're expecting that these things might help you, so we want to have them here. Good practices for churches to just have the equipment there and to think about that and to say how to use them. It's always important, too, to not just have it sitting there and everyone wondering what it is or to think that it's a distraction, right? But to give some information. So that's why you'll see what looks like a page from a sort of information that's on the slide here, and that's exactly what that is. That's our guide to movement and fidgets, because that's a very important piece of them being effective, right, is to let everyone know what they are, how to use them, and when maybe they need to actually go away because they are a distraction rather than helpful.
We all think that whatever the worship area looks like in a faith community, if they got rid of those little tiny golf pencils and replaced them with fidget pencils, a lot of people would be a lot happier. But anyway, so again, I think equipment can make a big deal. And there are ways to do this that are just so naturalizing. I know one community, they had hard pews, and they had on the back bench already, they had sort of these thick seat cushions for people who had really struggled to sit for an entire time of worship on those cushions. And they just added some wiggle cushions to that back row. It was just people were already used to borrowing some of those cushions, and now this was just another type of cushion to borrow. So again, another really innovative thing, because they knew that children through adults, this would be helpful. They just made up what the leader called pew pouches, I think was what they called them, and they just stocked them with some things. Anybody in the pew could use them, and then they just said, hey, if you want to put them back when you're done. But you're right. Anytime you hand that out, people need instructions and can celebrate that God's design in us is incredibly diverse, and what a gift it is that we can come together in worship. But really celebrate that for some people, having something to hold in their hands is going to really allow for worship in wonderful and excellent ways, where for another person, they may not need or want that particular item. But we're going to provide that because of God's amazing design in each of us. I think another thing that we have seen so much is that as communities begin to think for worshiping with members of all abilities, one great description of varied abilities is to have a 3-year-old and a 57-year-old in the same worship space. I mean, that's
called varied abilities.
That's right, called varied abilities, just the life experiences and what that person can do. And so intergenerational worship, we have seen some really neat and innovative tools. Again, I would say as people worship together with people of all ages, and I'm going to save a little bit of the previews for the next section when we talk about technology, but I did want to note that in addition to pew pouches and headphones and a wide variety of spaces or movement options that are allowed, one of the other items that people have loved and have used lately are these merged orders of worship. So whatever that looks like in your faith community, what some communities have done is put words with pictures so that everybody can follow along that schedule called the Order of Worship. And what one community did was they put a little check mark in front of each item. And so especially, whoever was really into it, they just took their pencil and they could check it off, we're done. Although one little girl came up to the organizer afterwards and said, we need way more check marks in front of that thing called sermon. So I think they did. They put like 5 check marks in front of there so that they could continue to move through that. But really neat when you think about things like cushions and pew pouches or fidget tools or hand tools or merged worship schedules. You really think, look, we're not talking about 20 to 25% of the congregation that benefits. We're talking about 100%. Yeah, that's right. And I know that my father, again, as he was getting older and less able to understand and use words, boy, did he rely on those pictures and the visuals and the things to hold on to, and what a gift that was to him as well. So ages and stages, but doing life together as a worshiping community is pretty powerful. So also wanted to mention some innovation with technology, and I think one of the huge things we have learned, if you can get people material ahead of time, and some congregations are so good about doing this. I know the YouVersion of the Bible has even these event.
Yeah, you can basically live stream. Pastors can upload their sermons right up to it, and with all of their notes and everything, so people can follow right along without ever having to have anything printed. But again, you can have the scripture read aloud to you through that. You can size it to any size you want. You can change versions for better understanding. For example, you could look up the New International Reader's Version, even though the pastor's using the New International Version in his notes or what have you. So many options in there. And again, technology just creates such a level playing field. You can change the background color on things. You can take pictures and add pictures into things. Again, we've had people sit next to each other. I've seen someone sitting next to them typing it up on a machine so that there are basically captions flowing for her husband as he's taking everything in. If he can't hear it well and he hasn't learned ASL because his hearing difference has come on in age. And so many different options with technology out there. And how many of us have a mobile device in our pocket at every moment of the day that has a recorder in it, has a video player in it? So many options are available through these little things called smartphones now that we really almost have no excuse for this anymore, because there are so many things available for us to use to, again, just keep it a level playing field and allow so many more people to participate than might participate with just having to listen to spoken words or to sing or to read small text in the Pew Bible or words on a screen that may not be visually accessible for them.
And we also know some churches have taken great advantage of what we call the hotel tour. We always ask, who here checks out your hotel before you actually get there? And clearly most of us do, because we want to know, like, have they redecorated since the 1970s, or does it look clean? Breakfast? Yes, and are there only carbs for breakfast? Should I pack my swimming suit? How many stars do they have? And so many congregations now are posting like that hotel preview on their websites of what happens in, could be a children's ministry area, it could be an adult ministry area, it could be worship, but literally people can log on and see those things ahead of time. And we always say, if your preview has at least one person with a visible area of disability, you have communicated a lot to people who are looking for a place of worship. So, we're seeing people do some amazing and wonderful things with technology. And, again, we will often say to people, most people will appreciate having the youth group retreat and some information about that and what might happen and what food they might serve and what does the place look like where we're going to sleep. Some people might enjoy looking at that, but there will be some people who will need to see it in order to participate. And so, again, always trying to have those options available, but that has been sort of a cool piece. I think the other thing that we have noticed that's been very exciting is just the new amount of material that's available, especially children and youth in mind, but also adults. And so I just want to comment, Back in the 1990s, I remember writing a book called Helping Kids Include Kids with Disabilities. This is the second edition, by the way, because the words in there got very old and I was sort of embarrassed to pass it out, so I'm comfortable with the second edition. But there were just not a lot of resources out there for congregations. And in resources, I have to say I'm always honored to find a book that I have written, and it might be from that Christian perspective, but it's in the Jewish Resource Center, or again, a wonderful book from my friend Shelley Christensen, targeting or helping to support people from the Jewish tradition. Again, something that I can learn by. So we are, just delighted to see the amount of information from, Bethesda Lutheran, from the Presbyterian Church in America, different organizations that have so many different communities. We were part. You want to tell about the Vatican?
Yeah, I was going to say the Catholic Church is actually really going all out on this. The Vatican has signed a charter called Living Fully, and that's creating these modules of very involved lessons for every parish to understand what it will look like for them to think for including people with varied abilities as a parish, and that's across every setting of Catholic gatherings. And so this is really exciting. They asked us to participate by coming up with some of the resources for them, and we just got very, very excited for the possibilities that this is going to lead to and the communities of belonging that are forming because of this charter that is coming right from the top of the Catholic Church, saying this is important to each and every Catholic community. And so there are denominationally based resources now, like she said, with the Lutheran, Bethesda Lutheran, but also they were resourcing for many, many others, not just the Lutheran Church, Mission to North America, the Presbyterian Church, and so many others, so many non-denominational resources out there as well, the Faith Inclusion Network, so many others, LaTanya Penny's work with Mary's Grace, and just what she's doing down there in North Carolina. So many things are now coming out that it used to feel like a sparse land and you'd have to Google for a very long time to come up with anything. But now if you look for some disability inclusion or faith inclusion resources, there really are some really great things coming out together. And I know, of course, Eric Carter and his work with this collaborative have been a huge piece of that as well.
And sort of counting on Eric and crew to sort of know what all is out there. So if you ever wonder, is there anything from this particular faith perspective, you can get a hold of Bill Gaventa, Eric Carter, that crew, to say what's available, and they are so on top of that. But we have just been delighted. And again, it's not just books. There are webinars and TED Talks and 5 minutes here and, consulting. There's just this vast level of resources. And we have learned early on, and, often we will admit as we speak, we come from, a Christian perspective, but we also ask that we never let differences in faith traditions spoil a good idea. And so I'm all ears as I listen to people from a variety of faith perspectives, and how can I translate that and use that within the congregation where I am. And I hope that people even today have been able to put that into practice. I might have referenced Easter, but what does Easter look like in, what's that holiday within a Jewish tradition, and what is put in special in place in that community on that day. So I think we have to be good translators of materials. But so I will just highlight a few that I'm really excited about. The ones that came up first, Friendship Together and Heart Shaper. I guess these have intrigued me, because instead of coming up with a curriculum, the two on the bottom corner there are curriculum resources, and they really focus on how can we take this idea of universal design, and instead of creating something separate, how can we just build it in and all hang out together? So Friendship Ministries has put together a Together Bible study where literally it is an adult or youth, I suppose youth
or intergenerational, really
intergenerational material units, where it's just totally easy to pull in or include an individual who may have Down syndrome, or who may be an English language learner, or
experiencing dementia,
or a person experiencing dementia. And we literally have tried these materials in a variety of settings, but really excited. It's online, it's techie, it's visual, and they have created this based on principles of universal design. Heart Shaper is part of David C. Cook. publishers, and they too, instead of having a separate guide or curriculum for quote unquote the special needs community, they just have it built all the way through. So again, when you see it right on the leader's guide, oh, if you have a child who would prefer whatever, it
or if
says
this task
something.
is difficult, try this alternative, or have these options available for kids to choose. And if this activity is more difficult, simplify it this way. If this isn't challenging enough, try adding this as an extra challenge. Options, right? Again, it's all about options when we're talking universal design. And when that's built into the curriculum, then that means that there are visual, there are interactives, there are object lessons, there's writing and speaking and singing and all of these other options for how to engage in the material.
Absolutely. And then we could put up so many different books, but boy, they're just popping out. Dr. Steve Gersvich has put out Mental Health in the Church. What an important book, and communities need to read that. And then we have, of course, if you're speaking and you're an author, you should put at least one of your books on there. So Accessible Gospel Inclusive Worship, I've enjoyed, again, presenting ideas for how can we worship as one body. And again, from Longing to Belonging, I find that information valuable from my colleague who works within primarily the Jewish community. Every Child Welcome, again, a wonderful resource for, I'll just say, setting the table. They formatted it like a cookbook, but again, we're expecting people of varied abilities to come and to show up. So at CLC Network, log on. We bag up materials all the time, stuff. We think if you have the right tools, it's much easier to say everyone welcome. And so, that's something we've been passionate about, of resourcing what we call the front line. We're not the front line, but boy, do we love to resource the communities, the congregations, as they welcome individuals of all abilities. And then finally, number 7, is, I think, one thing we're doing a lot of thinking about, partly because we have learned from some wonderful individuals, is this topic takes place within a cultural context. And so my first learning about that was from Maria Corneau, Dr. Corneau, within the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And so, she was saying, as we often will go out and speak together, she was saying, it's interesting because this idea of approaching a parent to say, hey, could we perhaps help with Judy or Maria during the worship service, said for some individuals from a culture where it is an expectation of the mother to care and care well for that child, it would perhaps be viewed as offensive to approach her in that way. She said, you really have to know the cultural context from which people, operate. And so we are so pleased to have the recent doctorate, congratulations, Reverend LaTanya Penny, who has done some amazing research within the African American Church. And so, LaTanya, we'd love to hand it off to you in terms of talking about that topic for a bit.
Sure, thank you. So thank you for having me today. My doctoral work was Womanist Theology of Differently Abled and the African American Church. What I discovered, first of all, being a mother of children with disabilities and special needs, was that we had to figure out why the Black church wasn't doing anything about the topic. So I went to a conference, heard Barb, met Tori, and was floored about all the things they were doing in many different congregations, and realized in North Carolina, the African American churches were so far behind. As a mom of children with special needs, I asked the question, why isn't the church leading the way in making these accommodations? So my research showed us that part of the reason is that as an African-American culture, our issue begins with how we were brought to this land, how we were brought to America, and how we were taught to embody being Black. A part of our cultural challenges in dealing with persons with disabilities and with the families is understanding the root of shame and the root of hiding disabilities. We were taught to hide our disabilities. We were taught very early on as slaves that we can't tell the master that we may have a child with a disability, or we're injured, or have any kind of special needs, because we would have been seen as weaker and less than, and oftentimes removed from the plantation, or just disappear. So from very early on, as we came to America, we learned to hide disabilities. We didn't talk about it. We hid children with disabilities. We didn't name those things. And although slavery no longer exists, that mentality has been passed on from generation to generation, not understanding why disabilities has been a hidden or a conversation that most African American churches aren't willing to have. So what I do with one of the works with Mary's Grace is working with African American churches to understand the stigma, understand why we are not willing to talk, but offer a platform and a place that is safe and secure for them to talk about their children who may have some type of disability. In doing so, we realized that if there are more people in our congregation, from young to old, that have some sort of special needs. And when they see that they are not alone, they're more willing to talk about it. So one thing that the church is called to do is have uncomfortable conversations around what it means to be a Christian, what it means to believe in God, and have something that causes you to be marginalized from the church population. As an African American woman, we experience this marginalization on a day-to-day basis, but what does it mean to do that in the church? And how do we stop that marginalization in the church? So we've been working really hard to understand, number one, the shame and the guilt that was imposed on us very early on, and trying to give a counter conversation on moving past that shame, that guilt, and that inability to discuss that. We're doing that in small group sessions throughout many churches, having book studies about what does it mean to embody a body that is differently able. Changing the language. I just did that in that sentence, from being disabled or being seen as broken to empowering language of differently able, because we're all differently able. I don't know about you, but if you live long enough, you'll see a change in your body. And some of the things I could do in my teens, Lord knows I cannot do now. So I say that I'm differently able, and that we all reach church differently abled. And what does the church need to do about that? I believe that the church is called to be as hospitable as possible. I believe that the church is called to look beyond the norms and to figure out ways to embrace all the things that Barb and Tori have just been speaking on, but embrace that and embody that as a part of who they are. I spoke at a church recently who could check off the boxes of doing inclusion ministry very well. The problem was no one knew they were doing it. They were doing it so well in-house that no one knew publicly until you sat in their church. No one knew if you were in their service on a Sunday morning that they had gluten-free communion, because it wasn't in a bulletin. It wasn't on their website. It wasn't advertised in any perspective. They just knew. So visitors were still feeling like they weren't welcome. So just working with churches to figure out, how do we take all those great things that the CLC network has put together and other people have written books about, and apply those concepts in our church, especially the African American church and other minority populations where we're so far behind the curve in understanding inclusion and in church. One way of doing that is taking it to a biblical perspective. I believe if you can take people to the Word, that they are more willing and more able to understand why we're called to do that. So my work has been around the Luke 5 text of the man on the paralyzed mat being carried, some say by 4 men. It doesn't matter to me if it's 4 men, 4 women, or however many people are carrying this mat. But I don't focus on the man with the disability and the man that is paralyzed. My focus is on the people who are carrying the mat, and the lengths that they are willing to go to remove the barriers so that he can get to Jesus. As a matter of fact, the Bible even says it's because of their actions that the man receives his healing and his forgiveness. So what does that mean for us? It means that we are called to remove those barriers. It is a call in ministry for us to figure out what is hindering people in the community from being able to embrace God in a different way, and whether that's attending church or participating in Sunday school or Bible study or singing in the choir. Whatever those barriers are, we are called to walk with and join with people so that we can remove those barriers, not putting on the person who is differently able, but putting the pressure back on the church to be the church for all people and create that welcoming atmosphere. So that's really my focus in the African American church is, number one, teaching why we are ashamed, why we're taught not to talk about things, and giving them tools to talk about and ways to talk about, and then showing them how to remove the barriers. So not only is that in the African American church, but that's in many marginalized communities that we are really trying to figure out, how do we remove the barriers? How do we get people willing to have the conversation? Barb and Tori came down for a training that I did in August, and getting Black churches to show up was really difficult. But once we got them there, it was an amazing transformation. And we're looking to do that throughout the country, especially starting in the South, moving our way up. I have a passion for the South, but making sure we're able to help people see it is not that it's extra work. It's just thinking differently. How do we do church in a different way so that all are welcome, all are included, and all can be at God's table? Thank you for having me. I know we wanted to leave room for questions, so I'm going to pass it off to Eric. I did mine in 6 minutes, so I'm actually proud of myself.
That was fantastic. Let me start with a personal question to you, Dr. Penny. Where can someone learn more about the research that you've done? Is there can someone request that from you, or is there a place that's available?
So the dissertation has not been published yet. It's already been sent off, and that will eventually turn into a separate book. But if people request, I will release parts of my dissertation out to them. Right. And so they can send me an email, and you all can provide that at any time.
Right. Well, congratulations on the doctorate. So there's a few questions that have already come in through the chat. I'd encourage other people to post those, or you can send those directly in to me. I'm going to go back way earlier to a question that came up as you were talking about the 7 different sort of elements of this inclusive religious education. Someone wrote that our church is doing really well in this area with children and youth, but there's a substantial drop-off in support and awareness for those over 18. Any suggestions on how to expand support and awareness for adults for that demographic?
That was Bronwyn, I believe. I think I met her a month ago at Inclusion Fusion Live.
Oh, that's great. Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that resource from Friendship Ministries. I think that having a tool that a congregation can use to allow people to be in that same space and continue to think about faith formation. I was with my father too, needing to have some different tools in order to allow people to enter into that time of learning. I also think relationships are so very, very important. And whatever that looks like, however those are formed, relationships allow people to stay in community. I think that's probably what I've heard most from congregations who have pretty vibrant opportunities for adults of all abilities. Mm-hmm. That is, we form relationships first. And I think the Together curriculum has given a tool to allow people to be in a small group, which can help form those relationships. But I think that active opportunity to think more, this is all about Justin. It's not about, how do we build a program for adults with disabilities.
I've met with a church actually who's thinking very intentionally about this, because there was a young man who had long outgrown youth group, but really enjoyed it. And actually the youth group leader was really good friends with him. And so he just kept coming to youth group, even though he was well into his 20s. And they finally had to say, this may no longer be appropriate unless he has a specific role here. And so did some brainstorming to say, it would be perfectly appropriate for him to come if he is taking on the role of serving the refreshments and gets to join in that way, or if he is, the question asker for the group and how, brings around the mic, what have you. But thinking through what his giftings were, and I think a big piece can be is that so often when we're accommodating for an individual, up through children's ministry, youth ministry, up to the age we're graduating high school, and people sort of go on to pursue their other areas of life and start to use their own skills, an individual, particularly with an intellectual disability, can somewhat feel left behind and just continuing to hang on to those pieces that have still been familiar. But this church really had to say, yeah, what does he love to do? What is he good at? He has skills and can continue to develop those skills. And he can actually be a great example and mentor to these youth group kids if we can continue to guide him and if we put things into place for him to be a respected adult who is here for a purpose. And then also he's developing relationships with other adults who have been volunteering, and he was a far better and more committed volunteer than they were. And so he was inspiring other adults. And so that really grew a beautiful, synergistic relationship so that everyone had a place, not just to belong, but to serve as well. And I think that's a key element too, is that we cannot underestimate what any youth can do. And so as we think about those transition plans, again, having materials available for people to access at every area, at every point possible, really welcomes everyone to participate in those religious education pieces. But again, having opportunities to serve is a great way to build relationship and to engage in long-term things that are going to stick in your faith community.
And I think that shredded cheese model has some potential here too. Again, I've talked to way too many people, for example, in children's ministry who say, oh, I'm so nervous for them to go to youth ministry, so we'll just keep everybody here in children's ministry. It's like, no, don't do that. You have just robbed the chance for people to be together. And so I think, again, it's coming up with the tools that allow that to happen, but we can never neglect that tool of relationship. That's really, really important.
So you mentioned the shredded cheese example, and there was a question that came to me directly related to this. The churches are so inclined to divide people by demographic. And so how do you respond to a church that says, well, disability is one more of those demographics that we set up a particular class for or program for? You're challenging that and saying this is different. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I think one of the things I often clarify is when we use that word disability, who are we talking about? And I'll often say, oh, that could be an infant with spina bifida, a toddler with Down syndrome, an elementary age child with a learning disability or ADHD, a youth group member with autism spectrum disorder, an adult with bipolar disorder, or a senior with limited vision, hearing, mobility, memory. And then I would say, okay, we're going to put every one of those individuals into one room. What exactly do they have in common? And I think,
right?
What would they do together? Which could be interesting, but in many ways, people have a particular view of that word disability and haven't really thought, okay, and as you explore the concept, I think, of universal design, many congregations have people who may not be fluent in the language that is spoken in that church. Many congregations do things with people of various ages. Many individuals can think about aging. As LaTanya mentioned, it is not for cowards. I am finding that out, right? So you come across unique challenges that you've not had in the past. And so as we create options and as we think for a variety of settings, I think we really are benefiting 100% of the congregation.
I think one of the dangers is that we like to, just as people, organize things into boxes. And so it makes sense in our heads, theoretically, to just formulate a box where this will all fit. And we also like to think of an us and a them in terms of how we build our ministry to those people. And I think it's a little scarier and much more realistic to think about all of us and how do we each fit into places where we are learning and growing and giving and serving, and each one of us has a place to do each of those things. And it's a bigger, broader task. It may seem a bit messier, but that's because that's real life with real people. And at a conference we were talking and someone asked a question, we all agreed, yeah, it just gets messier the more people you involve, doesn't it? And so I think that we like to keep it neat and clean. And the true answer, I'm sorry to say, is that it's probably not going to be neat and clean like that. So.
Well, I think all three of you spoke to this in small ways, but one of the comments was, my church is in the beginning stages of starting our special needs ministry, and we want to be intentional about getting the word out to our community. We're working on our church website, and we're working on expanding our promotional materials. The question is, what other ways have you found work best when it comes to marketing your programs, your ministries, your resources, whatever you call that?
LaTanya, do you have any that you have been seeing, noticing, and urging people to do?
So our response, because we're a smaller church and having a fancy website was not something that was in our budget, but we're able to use Facebook and Facebook groups and sharing information within our community. We're intentional of reaching out to our community, to parenting support groups, to schools that may have special needs population, a higher level special needs population, and to other churches. So we did most of our, and we still do most of our marketing material through either word of mouth or social media, because many people won't go to your website, but they'll see what you're doing in social media and making sure that people are able to see that on social media.
And I would add to that too. I think that is a hot question that we get from individuals. In addition to that, I've seen some churches be very effective at sponsoring a hot topic event. So a sensory friendly whatever. By titling your event as a sensory friendly, or we have a sensory friendly section or whatever, you've just communicated a lot. Same thing with the idea we have a trauma informed, whatever. So those, I think sometimes, and of course you have to back it up and actually have those things for people, but as you are advertising and using some of the language that individuals, adults, and families are looking for, you communicate a lot by advertising those kinds of events.
One of the things that you could try doing is a buddy break. Nathaniel's Hope has a great resource for setting up to do a regular respite time for families that's called Buddy Break, and they have incredible training, and so therefore your people will be very soundly trained, and parents can be assured that people know what they're doing when they bring their kids here to this event. But again, having an event is a great way to bring people into your space, get them to engage with your community, who you are, and get to know what it is that you have to offer, and to know that, you can back up what you're saying when you say, we welcome people with sensory differences, we know how to work with things, we're ready to accommodate, this is what we have here, some of those types of things. So again, even if it's not on a website, if that's not an option, or if people just aren't looking at web pages for whatever reason, then they can come and see the space themselves in a very open and welcoming way. So
you began the webinar talking about the shift in question from why to how. And so it's certainly true that there are more and more people who are receptive to this, but there's still a lot of reluctance. So what are one or two major areas of reluctance that you hear, and how do you help turn that reluctance into receptivity?
Would you say budget is quite often something people are afraid of?
I think people do mention budget. They'll say this is going to be expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think perhaps fear of something that has happened in the past that was perhaps not well planned or well thought through. And so not willing to really take a chance on that again. I don't know, LaTanya, do you have some other words?
So most of the churches that we deal with, it's budget. How much is this going to cost? And personnel. We have, what if my church is too small? So those are the two things, money and people.
Or the energy for the people. So many pastors will just kind of take this, the wide-eyed look of, oh no, we need to stretch our people a little further and try to make them do a little bit more with what we already have going on. But again, that thought of the shredded cheese seems to bring a big sigh of relief to say, sometimes it's just the small things, and actually resourcing the people who are already trying to do this brings that big sort of, oh, this isn't such a big overwhelming task. We don't have to build up something big and new and market it and all of these types of things. And it doesn't have to be a big, scary undertaking to do a few things well that really do welcome more individuals.
And I would say the best treatment or antidote is to go back to what LaTanya said. And what is the theology of your faith community? What is the scripture that rings true with people? And call them to the mat, call them to the Moses and Aaron kind of relationships, call them to whatever that piece is within your community that allows people to see, look, this is God's design for our community. We're going to enter in whether it looks scary or not. we trust that God's going to supply the pieces.
Well, that's a great place to close. And let me just extend my thanks to LaTanya and Barb and Tori for what you're sharing, for the compelling guidance and resources that you're providing. And we hope this webinar will be useful for many, even beyond who are on right now. So I just want to thank those of you who've joined us as audience and for your questions. Let you know that our prior webinars are archived at faithanddisability.org/webinar. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Summer Institute on Theology and Disability, that is a place to be in the midst of these kinds of conversations, and that takes place at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, later this month, May 20th through 23rd. You can also learn more about that on the Faith and Disability website. So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful summer.